With respect to the war between Israel and Hamas, no one wants to see Palestinians in Gaza go hungry and thirsty. The United States supports the flow of humanitarian aid with safeguards to ensure assistance is not diverted, looted, or misused by the terrorist groups Hamas, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But let us remember, Hamas bears sole responsibility for the war they unleashed on October 7, 2023, when it committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust and abducted more than 250 hostages, as well as for the resumption of hostilities in March following Hamas's rejection of multiple proposals.
Not to forget the plight of more than 10 million displaced Ukrainians, 7 million of whom are refugees. It is crucial to continue to plan for their eventual return to their communities. But they will not return unless they can be safe and secure in the short and in the long term. Unless the sirens truly stop announcing incoming attacks. Unless they have access to decent housing, services, and work. And unless they are confident that the terms of peace are durable for them and for their country.
Let us recall that 2014, after the coup in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Russians and Russian language residents of Ukraine turned towards Russia, fleeing Ukraine. The mass exodus from Ukraine to Russia has been ongoing in recent years as a result of the unabated shelling by the Ukrainian armed forces and their shelling of peaceful areas in Donbass. Approximately 5 million people are seeking shelter in Russian regions, and Russia is continuing to provide full assistance to accommodate and resettle these persons, as well as to provide them with comprehensive assistance. UNHCR representatives in Moscow are always able to see for themselves how effective the work that is being carried out is in various Russian regions vis-a-vis the provision of dignified living conditions for refugees.
President, just now, High Commissioner Grandi and other colleagues mentioned the severe humanitarian challenges faced by many regions in the world, which struck a chord with China. In Palestine, a new round of conflicts have led to a dire humanitarian crisis for more than 2 million suffering souls in Gaza. Achieving a ceasefire must be an overriding priority. The international community must be unequivocal in opposing any forced migration of the population of Gaza and any attempt to annex land in Gaza or the West Bank. In Syria, the recurring volatility of the situation has created a serious refugee problem, which poses a challenge to the stable development of the region and the country. The Syrian authorities should expedite an inclusive political process, effectively fulfill their counterterrorism obligations, restore peace and stability in Syria as soon as possible, and facilitate the return of refugees.
The 9,905th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is briefing by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Filippo Grandi, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Filippo Grandi. Thank you, Mr. President. For several years, the Security Council has been kind enough to invite me regularly to share my views regarding the global situation of refugees and other persons pursuant to the HCR mandate. Therefore, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you for inviting me yet again here, and quite likely this is the last time as the High Commissioner for Refugees. Thank you for inviting me under the auspices of the French presidency. This is a useful practice which is part of your procedures, and I encourage you to continue with it.
This is a season of war. This is a time of crisis. From Sudan to Ukraine, from the Sahel to Myanmar, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Haiti, violence has become the defining currency of our age. While UNHCR is not part of the United Nations response in Gaza, the situation of civilians there, which we thought could not get worse, is reaching new levels of desperation by the day. I realize I'm not telling the member of this council anything you do not already know, which is an indictment in itself. But unfortunately, that is the reality of our world. One where, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, 120 conflicts rage unabated. Each one of them fueled by the same perverse yet powerful delusion that peace is for the weak, that the only way to end war is not through negotiation but by inflicting so much pain on your enemies that they're left with two choices: to surrender or to be annihilated. And so, blinded by the idea that only total military victory will do, it should come as no surprise that the norms of international humanitarian law, once held in respect, or at least proclaimed to be, protecting civilians, upholding the neutrality of humanitarian actors, allowing the most basic aid to reach people under siege, are cast aside, dismissed as easily as the thousands of lives destroyed in the pursuit of supremacy. As Pope Francis said, I quote, "Every war represents not only a defeat of politics, but also a shameful surrender," unquote. He is gone, sadly, but his words remain more urgent than ever. Preventing and stopping war, upholding peace and security, this is the Security Council's mandate. This is your primary responsibility, and one that, you will forgive me for again saying it, this body has chronically failed to live up to. But please, do not resign yourselves to the defeat of diplomacy. I speak to you today once more on behalf of the 123 million people forcibly displaced, who are among the first victims of wars, and in many ways the most visible symptom of conflict and persecution. Caught in devastating situations, they have sought safety, or at least attempted to. But they will continue to hope for a safe return. And they, I know, will not be resigned and will not want us to be. Like the people of Sudan, 1/3 of whom have been displaced since the start of the conflict 2 years ago. 1 out of every 3 people forced to flee their homes because of a situation that, frankly, defies description: the indiscriminate violence, disease, starvation, rampant sexual atrocities, flooding, droughts. A country and a society torn apart in a context where all pretense of adherence to humanitarian norms has been abandoned. I was in Chad earlier this month, at the border with Sudan. I met women and children who had just arrived from embattled El Fasher and Zamzam. They reported horrors, but above all, fear. Civilians in Darfur are regularly blocked from fleeing dangerous areas. Worse, they're actively targeted. You will have seen recent reports of attacks against civilians in and around displacement camps, where delivering aid is not only a security and logistical challenge, as it is in the rest of the country, but also a bureaucratic nightmare intertwined with toxic politics. That is why it was so significant that those same families telling me their stories, pointed at the border and said that crossing it, in spite of all hardships they knew they would endure, meant leaving at least that fear behind. No better testament to the life-saving power of asylum. As the number of displaced Sudanese continues to grow, humanitarians have sounded the alarm about the terrible human cost exacted from the Sudanese people and from their future. Warning also, as I did again at the London conference only a few days ago, that the consequences of this conflict have now spread well beyond Sudan's borders, and especially to those countries which collectively host more than 3 million Sudanese refugees, from Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, to the Central African Republic. The most impacted are Chad and South Sudan, which face enormous challenges of their own besides the refugee influx, but that have kept their borders open despite vastly insufficient humanitarian financing. The latest regional refugee appeal is only 11% funded. Yet the needs are enormous. Refugees arrive with nothing and are given a fraction of what is required because of declining aid funding, plus whatever Chadian communities near the border can afford. The authorities, the Chadian authorities, are sparing no effort. Chadian refugee laws and policies are among the most progressive in the world. What they lack are resources, so they can continue receiving refugees. We cannot leave them alone. Because there is nothing inevitable, Mr. President, about the decision to host, protect, and assist refugees. Much less welcoming responses to displacement in much wealthier countries clearly show that. All countries make choices, and you have heard me disagree with many. In this instance, refugee-receiving countries are making the right decision. They are doing their part. We, the humanitarians, are on the ground doing our part. You must be more committed and more united to do yours. Every day that passes without the parties to the Sudan conflict coming to the negotiating table makes the war worse. Makes the war more complicated too. Refugees talk of not just two parties, but of a proliferation of local militias loosely affiliated to the main actors perpetrating violent abuse. This deadly confusion is a feature of modern wars. We should have learned lessons from wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Afghanistan, whose spillover consequences many members of this council still contend with to this day. Because if the current dynamics, resigned powerlessness and dwindling aid do not change, then let us harbor no illusions. The Sudan war's destabilizing effects will grow, including the onward movement of people. There are already more than 200,000 Sudanese in Libya today, many of whom may travel towards Europe. Mr. President, I also watch with great concern, like you, I'm sure, the latest developments in Ukraine, a country that I have visited 6 times since 2022. As recently as January, I was in Kiev and Sumy, cities that have again suffered devastating attacks just in the last few days. I saw the terrible toll this war continues to take on the Ukrainian people, and especially on the most vulnerable, the elderly, children, families, whose resilience nevertheless remains admirable, even as it has grown wary. UNHCR works closely with the government and local civil society partners to help alleviate the suffering and bring some normalcy and hope to people's lives. But clearly, as said by many, what people need is a just peace. My role is not to describe what it looks like, but to remind all those engaged in peace efforts not to forget the plight of more than 10 million displaced Ukrainians, 7 million of whom are refugees. It is crucial to continue to plan for their eventual return to their communities. But they will not return unless they can be safe and secure in the short and in the long term, unless the sirens truly stop announcing incoming attacks, unless they have access to decent housing, services, and work, and unless they are confident that the terms of peace are durable for them and for their country. That is the essential calculus for ending humanitarian and refugee crisis, Mr. President. Security and self-reliance, and both must convey a sense of being durable. Solutions are hard work. They require commitment and compromise. You cannot make peace passively or hope for it to happen through mere attrition. That is why it is all the more important that when even unexpected opportunities emerge, we must be ready to seize them and be ready to take calculated risks. For the last 8 years, for example, stagnation has defined the response in Myanmar. The fighting between the Tatmadaw and different armed groups has caused immense suffering and large-scale displacement throughout the country and the region, a situation exacerbated by the terrible earthquake that struck a month ago. The plight of the Rohingya minority in particular has become even worse. Fighting in Rakhine State with the Arakan army has been particularly vicious. 1.2 million Rohingya are refugees today, mostly in Bangladesh, in the camps around Cox's Bazar. And we must thank Bangladesh and its people for having provided them refuge over the years. But Rohingya refugees languish in the camps without work, deprived of agency, entirely dependent on humanitarian aid, which grows ever more precarious. Half the refugee population is under the age of 18. They are, to paraphrase Chief Advisor Dr. Yunus, disconnected from opportunity but connected to the world through the internet. Is it any wonder that many feel compelled to embark on dangerous sea journeys in pursuit of opportunity, or that those looking to recruit fighters find fertile soil? But there is now an opportunity to break this dangerous inertia. The interim government of Bangladesh has chosen to engage with the parties to the conflict in Rakhine State in pursuit of a solution there, where it rightly lies. Many will immediately say that such a solution today is impossible for all the reasons we know. Too much blood has been shed, discrimination continues, and there are too many competing interests to balance. Many will say that the root causes will never be effectively addressed, and that may well be the case. But we have been down the path of stagnation for 8 years in respect of the Rohingya situation. It is a dead end. From the perspective of pursuing solutions to the Rohingya plight, and in order to start recreating conditions for the return of refugees, dialogue with all parties is a critical first step, so that humanitarian agencies, including UNHCR, can re-establish their presence and resume providing desperately needed humanitarian relief safely and freely. That, in turn, would provide a basis on which to restart discussions on the eventual return of displaced Rohingya. I stress voluntarily, in safety and dignity, once the security situation in Rakhine allows, and from where other legal rights could also be pursued. It is a long shot, for sure, but I urge you to think out of the box and take some risks. I hope the Council will continue to focus robustly on the situation in Myanmar, including the plight of the Rohingya, and I look forward to the conference planned for September here in New York. Mr. President, other possible turning points are visible literally even from here. On Friday, the new flag of Syria was raised at the United Nations. What a powerful symbol for all Syrians. And there we have another long-standing humanitarian and displacement crisis for which an unexpected solution may now be achievable. But to pursue that, you must all prioritize the Syrian people over long-standing politics, some of which are frankly outdated. That also entails taking calculated risks. Of course, we cannot be naive. Many challenges remain, and you heard Minister Shaibani describe them here on Friday. It is impossible to overcome the devastation caused by 14 years of war in a few months. But for the first time in decades, there is a spark of hope, including for the millions of Syrians who remain displaced today, 4.5 million of them refugees in neighboring countries. Since the 8th of December, those numbers have been decreasing slowly but steadily as the return movement of internally displaced Syrians grow, and we observe an increase of returns also from Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. We estimate that over 1 million people have already returned, and based on what recent surveys show, many more may follow. Whether they will then stay in Syria or, tragically, move again, including to Europe and beyond, depends, of course, on the authorities, but also very much on your willingness to take risks, to ease sanctions, seriously support early recovery, spur investment by the private sector and others. In a word, create conditions so that the basic elements of dignified life, security, water, electricity, education, economic opportunities are available to the Syrian people as they start to rebuild their communities. To minimize the risks that returning Syrians are taking, I'm asking you to take some risks yourselves, political and economic ones. And yes, that must also mean sustained and more significant humanitarian aid, which at the moment, like everywhere else, is decreasing sharply. Mr. President, I would in fact be remiss before concluding if I did not draw the Council's attention on the critical situation of aid funding. In the precise moment where there is hope to finally move towards solutions to several displacement crises, not only in Syria, but also in Burundi or the Central African Republic, we see a retrenchment away from aid, away from multilateralism, even away from life-saving assistance. We hear of prioritizing national interests, of boosting defense spending, all valid concerns, of course, and legitimate state pursuits. But these are not incompatible with aid, quite the contrary. And so I find myself making the same argument time after time, trying to convince donor countries of a reality we can all clearly see, that aid is stability. Freezing or cutting aid budgets is already having fatal consequences on millions of lives. It means, among many other things, abandoning displaced people to their fate, taking support away from sometimes very fragile host countries, and ultimately undermining your own stability. And multilateralism, in fact, including multilateral aid, adds to the same stability and remains indispensable to find solutions to crises, including forced displacement. I may sound anachronistic, Mr. President, but after more than 40 years as a humanitarian and almost 10 years in my current job, I continue to believe that it is by sitting at the same table that all voices can be heard, the strong and the less strong. And to those who feel that multilateralism is stifling, slow, and misaligned with your priorities, I hope you realize that leaving the debate does not mean that the discussion would end. It will not, but it will be less effective and less compelling. We need all of you. Refugees offer one of the best examples of this shared task. Because if you look around this room, you will see, like I do, that forced displacement has concerned every member of the Security Council at one point, one way or the other. The struggle for freedom, the fight against oppression, the imperative to leave one's home behind because of war, violence, and persecution, the refuge given to those compelled to flee. These are also familiar strands in each of your country's histories, deeply woven in complex and unique ways into your traditions and values. You have been the refugee. You have welcomed those who sought refuge. Now you sit at this table with the responsibility to end war, to bring peace, and you must succeed. You owe it not only to all those who are displaced and who count on you, you also owe it to yourselves. Merci beaucoup.
Je remercie.
I thank the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the permanent representative of Algeria. Thank you, President.
I would like to express our sincere appreciation to Mr. Filippo Grandi for his comprehensive briefing. We also commend your unwavering commitment and tireless efforts in supporting and protecting refugees across the globe. The displacement crisis continues to deepen each year. The number of displaced persons is rising systematically due to multiple, often overlapping causes, in particular armed conflicts. This alarming increase has occurred in parallel with the decline of international funding, leaving millions of vulnerable individuals without access to life-saving assistance. This situation is unacceptable and reflects a broader failure to meet the needs of displaced population. Addressing this failure is a shared responsibility that must be borne equitably by the international community. In this context, it is crucial to reaffirm the commitments we collectively undertook in adopting the Global Compact on Refugees, which calls for predictable and equitable burden sharing and responsibility sharing, and also robust support for host communities. Regrettably, both refugees and host communities often feel abandoned in this human endeavor, and we shoulder immense burdens with limited support. Mr. President, for Algeria, prevention remains the most effective strategy, addressing the root causes of displacement, including armed conflict, including foreign occupation, including underdevelopment, is imperative. This calls for a development-oriented and multifaceted approach grounded in international cooperation. Meanwhile, the global refugee crisis we are witnessing requires urgent, coordinated, and sustained actions. In this regard, I wish to highlight the following key elements. First, ensuring the protection of refugees. Refugees, as a particularly vulnerable group, including women and girls, are entitled to protection under international refugee law. Yet, in recent years, we have witnessed multiple violations of this right. Palestinian refugees, particularly those in Gaza and in the West Bank, have suffered inhuman treatment and repeated forced displacement, including the destruction of camps, destruction of refugee camps, and civilian infrastructure. The international community, especially this Security Council, must fulfill its legal and moral obligations to protect these persons and uphold international humanitarian law. Second, mobilizing adequate and predictable funding. The ongoing financial crisis facing UNHCR and other humanitarian actors severely limits their capacity to deliver essential services. This is unacceptable. It must be emphasized that most refugee hosting countries are themselves developing countries. Their effort to provide sanctuary and services, basic services, should be matched by the donor community. International support must not be seen as charity, but as part of a shared global responsibility grounded in the principle of international solidarity. It should not also be subjected to political calculation and condition, or used as a tool for diplomatic bargaining. Third, Mr. President, combating misinformation and xenophobia, targeting refugees. Misinformation campaigns and inflammatory rhetorics put refugees' life at risk, fueling xenophobia and violence in host countries. These harmful narratives must be countered. Public awareness campaigns are essential to ensure that host communities are sensitized and that refugees are protected while awaiting durable solutions in accordance with international law. Mr. President, for over half a century, Algeria, my country, has hosted Sahrawi refugees in the Tindouf camps. These people were forcibly displaced due to the Moroccan occupation of their homeland. Throughout this period, 50 years, despite huge challenges. Algeria, in cooperation with UN agencies and humanitarian partners, has consistently ensured access to basic services for Sahrawi refugees. However, a durable solution is needed. This must include enabling Sahrawi refugees to exercise their inalienable right to self-determination through a free and fair referendum, as enshrined in international law and UN resolution. The decision about the future of the Sahrawi refugees is and must always rest with them. The rights of the Sahrawi refugees are inalienable. They must not be compromised or subjected to transactions under any circumstances. To conclude, Mr. President, I wish to underscore the fundamental principle that refugees must be allowed to live in dignity. This is their right as human beings. Also, a safe, dignified, and voluntary return to their home is a cornerstone of international refugee law. It must be respected. It must be upheld and never compromised. Let's work together to preserve the dignity of refugees and allow them enjoying their right, their full rights. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Algeria for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Panama welcomes the holding of this annual meeting with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, on the situation of refugees in crisis situations.
And for this council to be successful in upholding its mandate among this season of war, as you called it. And Panama believes that peace is for the strong, not for the weak. So, la comunidad.
The international community today is facing a situation of displacement which is of historic proportions. More than 120 million people have been forced to leave their homes worldwide, including refugees, asylum seekers, IDPs, and other individuals in need of international protection. This figure has steadily increased over the past 12 years, driven primarily by armed conflicts, widespread violence, persecutions, mass human rights violations, and the impact of climate change. This tragedy has a global impact. Human beings are facing risks such as transnational organized crime at all stages of displacement. This causes serious risk to their security, and it takes a toll on the capacity of vital humanitarian services and UN agencies to provide relief. For that reason, we reiterate our commitment to the Global Compact on Refugees, as well as our will and determination to work closely with the multilateral system to provide for the more than 43.7 million people in these circumstances. Situations such as the war in Ukraine have caused the destruction of civilian infrastructure, forcing the population to flee their homes in search of safety, protection, and aid. Since February 2022, 3.7 million displaced Ukrainians and almost 7 million refugees exist worldwide. We cannot forget the humanitarian situation in the DRC. It is critical, particularly in the provinces of North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri. More than 6.7 million people are displaced internally due to decades of indiscriminate violence. Moreover, more than 990,000 Congolese refugees and asylum seekers have been hosted in different countries in the African continent. We need relief efforts and resources from the entire international community to avoid the spread of instability. There is a risk that the convergence of these conflicts, of all these conflicts in the region, will lead to an unprecedented transnational crisis. In Sudan, more than 12 million people have had to flee their homes. Of them, approximately 3 million people have fled the country, seeking safety and protection in neighboring countries. Millions of girls and boys are suffering from high rates of food insecurity, and more than a dozen regions in the country are on the verge of starvation. In fact, the prevalence of starvation in the Zamzam camp in the north of Darfur has been confirmed because access for humanitarian agencies has been limited. Panama is speaking out for every girl and boy who today is crossing jungles, seas, and deserts, seeking what should never be lacking: a home, safety, and dignity. Childhood knows no borders, and their protection should know no borders either. Girls and boys represent 40% of the displaced population, despite the fact that they make up only 30% of the global population. I believe this is proof of their disproportionate vulnerability in the face of these crises. In Panama, we firmly believe that respect for human dignity must guide every one of our responses, bearing in mind that a portion of the mass wave of refugees and displaced persons worldwide are Venezuelan nationals. We cannot ignore the fact that the current economic situation, the democracy vacuum, and the rampant insecurity in Venezuela has worsened the migratory crisis throughout the hemisphere. Our region is going through challenging times with a lack of democratic guarantees and the resurgence of transnational organized crime, such as what is taking place in Haiti, have seriously worsened the displacement in Latin America and the Caribbean. That is on the rise and has been unprecedented. And we have reached a level of unsustainable global migratory crisis. In the short, medium, and long-term, protection and well-being for the world's population means we must safeguard the environment as part of our efforts to prevent conflicts and ensure lasting peace. We must make sure that the exploitation of natural resources does not overburden environmental capacity and become a source for social instability. Women refugees deserve particular attention. They are at constant risk of sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking in persons, sexual exploitation, forced marriages, and exclusion from essential services such as health, education, and employment. The lack of documentation worsens their situations and leaves them outside protection systems. In camps or in shelters, quite often, there are not sufficient security mechanisms or gender-sensitive mechanisms. This further increases their vulnerability. Mr. President, Panama believes that international protection for refugees and displaced persons is a matter of shared values. Having said that, we call for redoubled efforts to reverse the current trend of reduced humanitarian financing. We must bolster regional mechanisms and make it possible to share responsibilities more equitably. We reiterate our commitment to these principles, and we reaffirm our determination to work together with the international community to promote a global response focusing on the protection of human rights. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Thank you, Mr. President, we thank the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, for his statement addressing topical issues of international assistance to refugees and displaced persons. Assistance to refugees and addressing issues faced by refugees is particularly relevant in light of the unprecedented scale of humanitarian crises throughout the world. Last year marked a record in terms of the number of people who were forced to abandon their homes and countries in their quest to survive. When addressing the crisis of forced displacement, there is a need first and foremost to address the situation in Gaza. The indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza has already compelled more than 1 million Gazans to flee their homes in order to save their lives, even where destitute people find refuge and safe haven, they are threatened with mortal danger. Since 7 October, Israeli attacks on civilian objects, including refugee camps and other UNRWA facilities where people have found refuge, have resulted in the deaths of 742 people. More than 2,400 people have been wounded. Those who selflessly deliver assistance to Palestinian refugees are also dying as a result. Since the start of Israel's military operation, more than 290 UNRWA staff have been killed. The magnitude of the humanitarian disaster is growing. With each passing day, Israeli authorities continue to impede the entry of humanitarian assistance. For nearly 60 days, there has been a block on entry into Gaza of food and medicines, which has resulted in depleted supplies. The humanitarian organization has sounded the alarm about imminent hunger, first and foremost among children. There's no water, no food, no fuel in Gaza, and those who manage to flee the bombardment face hunger, communicable diseases, and a lack of necessary medical assistance. UNRWA, UNHCR's partner organization, continues to deliver assistance to Palestinian refugees, and they continue to be subject to unprecedented political pressure and threats, including threats of reduced financing, which is so necessary now. We understand that Palestinian refugees are not directly within the mandate of UNHCR. However, we hope the UN High Commissioner, as a senior UN official, will continue to monitor the situation and call upon Israel to comply with its international obligations. The situation in Gaza and the persecution of UNRWA blatantly demonstrates the stark reality of politicization of refugee and internally displaced persons issues. This is particularly evident in the financing of humanitarian programs for assisting refugees. Western countries who have provoked the lion's share of conflict throughout the world, and these conflicts that have triggered the flight of refugees, these Western countries are very reluctant to finance UNHCR programs to assist refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, and many other conflict-riven countries. Western countries are zealously enforcing a practice of enforced expulsions of refugee seekers residing on their soil. And the states of the Golden Billion continuously voice alarm about the situation of refugees from Ukraine. They fail to mention that a significant number of these refugees have turned towards Russia. There is a notorious practice of double standards being implemented, division of the world into first-class and second-class citizens. This politicization on the question of the voluntary return of Syrian refugees. For many years, the West has blocked their return to their homeland, including by thwarting the implementation of humanitarian projects. The West is now making declarations about assistance to Syrians. However, they continue to impose unilateral sanctions against Damascus, which afflict ordinary citizens. First and foremost, there's a murky situation in the notorious Al-Hol and Al-Roj refugee camps, where thousands of women and children who have fled the bombardment of Raqqa, Hajina, and Baghouz are seeking shelter. Let us recall that 2014, after the coup in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Russians and Russian language residents of Ukraine turned towards Russia, fleeing Ukraine. The mass exodus from Ukraine to Russia has been ongoing in recent years as a result of the unabated shelling by the Ukrainian armed forces and their shelling of peaceful areas in Donbass. Approximately 5 million people are seeking shelter in Russian regions, and Russia is continuing to provide full assistance to accommodate and resettle these persons, as well as to provide them with comprehensive assistance. UNHCR representatives in Moscow are always able to see for themselves how effective the work that is being carried out is in various Russian regions vis-à-vis the provision of dignified living conditions for refugees. In the context of the situation of refugees, the African continent stands out as an example. Despite the economic difficulties they face, African countries have for years been setting the example to the world vis-à-vis solidarity and assistance to displaced persons, in a stark contrast to Western countries. And here they have every right to count on international support and recognition. The burden of refugee outflows is borne by all neighboring states, including Egypt, CAR, Chad, Ethiopia, South Sudan. Together, these countries have already accommodated more than 2 million Sudanese. The number of internally displaced persons in the country is reaching 11 million people. This is a situation which makes it necessary to systematically step up assistance to the Sudanese government to address the whole gamut of humanitarian problems they face. Let us stress that cooperation can be established with the central authorities of the country, who bear the full responsibility to normalize the situation in the area of security and to address the myriad issues related to refugees and IDPs. I wish once again to draw attention to the plight of refugees in the Mediterranean. Year after year, the Mediterranean continues to be a mass grave for many of those who each year attempt to reach Europe. Appalling tragic deaths continue to occur on a regular basis. At the same time, when it comes to attempts to deliver assistance or response, this is something we have not seen from Western European countries. Instead of delivering assistance to victims, they are thrown out to areas outside of their jurisdiction, condemning people to certain death. And they continue to interfere in the activity of humanitarian NGOs who attempt to deliver assistance to refugees. The situation is intolerable in terms of international law, as well as in terms of pure humanity. People are dying, but nobody's being held accountable for this. Naturally, without delivery for refugees rescued at sea, with the provision of safe ports for them to disembark on shore, in accordance with international norms, the situation will not change. We call upon the UNHCR to continue to call upon the EU to comply with international obligations, to demonstrate accountability, and to combat impunity. To conclude, we wish to support Mr. Grandi's call about the need to continue to finance humanitarian efforts despite the financial difficulties. For our part, the Russian Federation wishes to note that, as financial constraints notwithstanding, last week Russia managed to allocate $2 million to support the activities of UNHCR. Thank you for your attention. I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for his enlightening briefing. Your briefing today is really a touching one. I remember that last year at this council, the High Commissioner described an unprecedented situation on forced displacement. As High Commissioner described today, since that time, the crisis has further deteriorated, with the number of forcibly displaced persons reaching over 122 million. The figures tell only part of the catastrophic story of suffering for those who have been forced to flee their homes. It is in part a reflection of our lack of collective efforts and will to take action. Given that, I'd like to make the following 4 points. First, the Security Council should show leadership in more action-oriented cooperation to eliminate immediate cause of forced displacement. Forced displacement is a direct consequence of the breakdown of peace and security, leaving people to feel insecure and unprotected. When ending conflict is out of reach, we have the obligation under international humanitarian law to protect the civilians in wartime. However, this responsibility is being increasingly neglected, as vividly demonstrated in the recent ongoing conflicts, including in Gaza, Sudan, and Ukraine. Therefore, the Security Council must speak with one voice in urging the immediate cessation of hostilities among the parties to this conflict. The Council should also consider, when appropriate, adopting binding resolutions to ensure compliance with IHL by all relevant parties. Second, we should shed more light on those who have no choice but to flee their homes due to systematic violations of basic human rights and humanitarian risks, and who risk of persecution, torture, or other brutalities if forced to return. The North Korean escapees are case in point. In this vein, we urge all UN member states to respect the principle of non-refoulement, which is stipulated in the Refugee Convention and the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Third, a multifaceted approach is required to tackle the lack of funding at a moment when all UN agencies are facing extreme financial constraints. It is essential to help humanitarian workers and host countries tackle humanitarian crises in a swift and flexible manner. Joining the effort to enhance flexibility, my government has scaled up its annual unearmarked contributions to the UNHCR fivefold last year and has decided to maintain it at a similar level this year as well. In this regard, I recommend that UNHCR diversify its funding sources to enhance the resilience of its financial foundation. Funding from various stakeholders can contribute to this goal, as in the example of the Republic of Korea, as its contributions from private donors account for nearly half of its total funding to the UNHCR. Lastly, we should provide our consistent support until the issue of forced displacement is ultimately resolved with a safe, voluntary, and dignified return of refugees. Their sustainable reintegration into their countries of origin and their resettlement in third countries. We can take Syria as an example, which is the origin of the largest number of displaced persons in the world. While we welcome the fall of Assad regime, we must recognize that this is only the first step toward resolving the situation of Syrian refugees. Unremitting effort to uphold the rule of law, promote justice and reconciliation, and safeguard human rights are essential to ensure that voluntary returnees can successfully reintegrate into their communities. Such progress will not only benefit Syria and its neighboring countries, but also contribute to long-term peace and stability in the region. In closing, Mr. President, as clearly articulated in the 1951 Refugee Convention, the problem of refugees cannot be resolved without international cooperation. And effective coordination in response to this issue depends upon the cooperation of states with the UNHCR. The Republic of Korea remains committed to joining the efforts of the international community to address the refugee issues. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank High Commissioner Grandi for today's briefing and his frank assessment of the ongoing displacement crisis. Guyana supports the critical work of the UN Refugee Agency and commends High Commissioner Grandi and his team for continuing to provide life-saving assistance and protection to millions of displaced people around the world, despite the growing number of challenges. Mr. President, we are undoubtedly in an era of rising geopolitical tensions, leading to unprecedented levels of armed violence and displacement. More than 120 million people were forcibly displaced in 2024. A global snapshot reveals that in the Americas, worsening gang violence in Haiti, fueled by trafficked weapons from abroad, has resulted in more than 1 million people being internally displaced. In Africa, conflicts in Sudan and the DRC have driven around 30 million IDPs, refugees, and asylum seekers from their homes. In Asia, over 3.5 million people were displaced in Myanmar. The largest war on the European continent since World War II has driven over 10 million Ukrainians from their homes, as High Commissioner Grandi reminded, and we continue to witness the repeated displacements in Gaza. The rise in conflict-induced displacement and involuntary resettlement poses a significant challenge to humanitarian and development organizations that are already grappling with a global funding squeeze. In 2025, an estimated $10.2 billion is needed to provide life-saving protection and assistance to a projected population of over 139 million forcibly displaced and stateless people. These numbers are staggering and demand our urgent attention, especially as the gap between needs and commitment continues to widen, leaving the humanitarian sector critically underfunded. Mr. President, none of us are insulated from the impacts of the ongoing displacement crisis, whether directly through the influx of people across our borders or indirectly through the spectrum of side effects that it engenders. We are all impacted. For the middle and low-income countries that host 71% of the world's refugees and others in need of international protection, the impacts on their social systems and national budgets are severe. In the health sector alone, a global cost analysis for including refugees in national health services estimates that this would require $11 billion a year. The imperative to accelerate the global response is clear. We must intensify our efforts to address the humanitarian needs of the forcibly displaced. At the same time, there must be greater urgency in addressing the drivers of conflict and displacement. Mass displacement is just one of the symptoms of the disease of war, violence, and economic instability. Climate change is also becoming a major driver of displacement. According to the 2024 Global Report on Internal Displacement, over the past 10 years, weather-related disasters have caused 220 million people to be internally displaced. Further, as climate disasters impact destination countries, the options for escape narrow, creating a protracted displacement crisis. We must also acknowledge that migration exists both as a result and a driver of conflict. If we fail to address these challenges, we will create a global cycle of unending and worsening tragedies. In the toolbox of solutions, the UNHCR is key. Yet the agency cannot act alone. It requires the cooperation and support of all member states and must be equipped with the resources necessary to effectively fulfill its mandate. This includes financial resources. We note that as of February, UNHCR had only received 14% of the required funding. Guyana also continues to advocate for a comprehensive and strategic approach in addressing the deficits in development, which lay at the root of the great majority of conflicts. The cost of inaction and failing to prioritize and invest in development and conflict prevention is simply too high. Mr. President, in closing, it bears repeating that the work of UNHCR and its partners is vital. We can and must enable them to continue to provide essential life-saving services, such as shelter, water, healthcare, and education. Guyana is committed to maintaining and further enhancing our partnership with the UNHCR and will continue to advocate for increased support for the agency. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Guyana for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank High Commissioner Grandi for his briefing. China pays tribute to UNHCR for its long-standing presence in conflict-ridden areas and for the assistance it has provided to millions of refugees, and will continue to support UNHCR and the High Commissioner Grandi in advancing the noble humanitarian cause. I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my appreciation to High Commissioner Grandi for his efforts during the last few years. At present, the international situation is complex and volatile, with high geopolitical tensions, persistent unilateral bullying, and shocks to the world economy. Against this backdrop, the global refugee situation has become increasingly serious and challenging. According to UNHCR reports, more than 120 million people has been forcibly displaced globally, and the relevant figure has been rising for 12 consecutive years. It was heartbreaking to note that a large number of refugees, especially women and children, have difficulty in obtaining assistance and suffer from hunger and displacement. Solving the refugee problem requires strengthening international cooperation and a comprehensive and systematic response. Recently, certain countries have drastically cut foreign aid, and many humanitarian organizations have been forced to reduce their aid activities. This is undoubtedly a serious blow to refugee relief, and more refugees may become displaced as a result. The top priority is to raise funds as quickly as possible to help refugees in distress. Low and middle income countries host 70% of all refugees. China calls on developed countries to shoulder their responsibilities by fulfilling their aid commitments and providing more support to refugee hosting countries and multilateral humanitarian organizations. War and conflicts are amongst the most important reasons why people are forced to flee their homes. The Security Council should promote ceasefires and stop violence, start dialogue and negotiation, and seek political solutions. Relevant countries should stop creating confrontation and provoking conflicts in the international arena and abandon unilateralism and hegemonic and bullying behavior. All parties should support post-conflict countries in accelerating recovery and reconstruction, enhancing their capacity for independent development, and creating the condition for refugees to return home as soon as possible. President, just now, High Commissioner Grandi and other colleagues mentioned the severe humanitarian challenges faced by many regions in the world, which struck a chord with China. In Palestine, a new round of conflicts have led to a dire humanitarian crisis for more than 2 million suffering souls in Gaza. Achieving a ceasefire must be an overriding priority. The international community must be unequivocal in opposing any forced migration of the population of Gaza and any attempt to annex land in Gaza or the West Bank. In Syria, the recurring volatility of the situation has created a serious refugee problem, which poses a challenge to the stable development of the region and the country. The Syrian authorities should expedite an inclusive political process, effectively fulfill their counterterrorism obligations, restore peace and stability in Syria as soon as possible, and facilitate the return of refugees. On the African continent, armed conflicts, terrorism, political turmoil, and development deficits overlapped and intertwine, and the humanitarian situation is particularly severe. In Sudan, the DRC, the Sahel, and other regions alone, tens of millions of people have been displaced. The international community must address both the symptoms and the root causes of the problem from multiple perspectives, including political, security, development, and humanitarian fronts. China calls on the international community to prioritize resources towards Africa and increase support and assistance to African countries. As a state party to the convention relating to the status of refugees and the protocol thereto, China has always adhered to the spirits of humanitarianism, actively participated in international cooperation in the field of refugees, and provided assistance to the countries concerned in dealing with the refugee issues through bilateral and multilateral channels. China is ready to continue to work with the international community, firmly support multilateralism, and contribute to improving the global refugee protection system and resolving the refugee issue. I thank you.
I thank the representative of China for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, High Commissioner Filippo Grandi, for your briefing. As you indeed highlighted, amid an increase in conflicts in recent years, the Security Council has failed to achieve the political solutions necessary to end forced displacement. As we have said in this chamber before, it is time for us to bring the UN, and specifically the Security Council, back to its original purpose, the maintenance of international peace and security, including through the peaceful settlement of disputes. This is our responsibility as Council members, to chart a path forward that can end the horrors of conflicts. But no one nation can do this alone. The UN exists for collective action, and collective action demands collective responsibility. Every member state needs to better share the burden of humanitarian response to conflict. The United States has disproportionately shouldered this burden for decades. Moreover, we reiterate that response to forced displacement should be guided by core principles of national sovereignty, border security, and the rule of law. Mr. President, in this past year, the conflicts in Sudan, the DRC, and Myanmar, among others, have worsened. With respect to the war between Israel and Hamas, no one wants to see Palestinians in Gaza go hungry and thirsty. The United States supports the flow of humanitarian aid with safeguards to ensure assistance is not diverted, looted, or misused by the terrorist groups Hamas, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But let us remember, Hamas bears sole responsibility for the war they unleashed on October 7th, 2023, when it committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust and abducted more than 250 hostages, as well as for the resumption of hostilities in March following Hamas's rejection of multiple proposals. Mr. President, even amidst this time of conflict, there has been some cause for hope. In Syria, with Assad's departure, there is a new sense of hope among millions of refugees who see the prospect for a future in their home country, and many have returned home, especially the ones who stayed close to home and did not attempt to make the perilous journey to Europe. The United States seeks a future in which Syria is stable, respects the human rights and freedoms of its people, rejects terrorism and destabilizing Iranian influence, and is not a threat to its neighbors. We believe many Syrian refugees and migrants have similar hopes for their country. Moving to Europe, this council called for a swift end to the war in Ukraine, and the United States has invested considerable political capital toward achieving that peace. If a lasting settlement can be reached, millions of Ukrainians will be able to return home. Mr. President, a durable peace in those conflicts would lay the foundation for millions of displaced people to safely return home and for thriving regional economies. We call on this council to redouble efforts to solve and bring an end to crises that lead to long-term displacement. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for that statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Denmark.
And I would like to begin by thanking you, High Commissioner Grandi, for the outstanding leadership demonstrated throughout your tenure. Denmark expresses its full support for UNHCR and deep admiration for all those who work tirelessly to assist the world's refugees and forcibly displaced people. Mr. President, we are at an extraordinary juncture. As we heard from the High Commissioner today, a staggering 123 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide. Women and girls continue to suffer most. This displacement crisis has many drivers. Most significantly, the proliferation and protractedness of crisis, combined with a widespread disregard for the letter and spirit of international humanitarian law. The impact of climate shocks also continues to grow. This presents a new challenge for humanitarian actions and solidarity in the 21st century. From Myanmar to Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan, we have witnessed violence, attacks on civilians, and critical civilian infrastructure, creating staggering levels of displacement. Mr. President, In Sudan, the world's largest displacement crisis, more than a third of the population have been forced to flee their homes, and over 60% of the population requires emergency humanitarian assistance. In Ukraine, attacks on civilian infrastructure, the contamination of agricultural land, and repeated strikes on populated areas have produced the largest refugee and displacement crisis in Europe since the Second World War, with almost 7 million fleeing across borders and another 3.7 million internally displaced. And in Gaza, an entire population, predominantly made up of refugees, is being denied humanitarian aid. The healthcare system has collapsed. UNRWA has been criminalized. Humanitarianism itself has become a target. With these deeply disturbing examples in mind, allow me to make 3 points. First, the United Nations and its humanitarian partners must always be allowed to support these most vulnerable populations. In complex humanitarian emergency settings, it must have safe and unhindered access to those in need. This is the essential precondition for any meaningful response. It is also an obligation on all parties to conflict. In this regard, the Council and all UN member states must unequivocally reject the deliberate use of bureaucratic and administrative obstructions to deny this access, whether imposed by states or non-state actors. From Gaza to Ukraine and Sudan, these tactics cannot be tolerated. In extreme cases, Denmark believes that this Council has a duty to use the tools at its disposal to overcome such barriers. Second, I'm proud to say that Denmark is currently the 4th largest donor to UNHCR, an important donor to the broader humanitarian system. However, as expressed by the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, the humanitarian system is being reset. UNHCR itself is undergoing dramatic organizational adjustments that will impact its core capacities and operational outreach. Throughout this period of change, we must collectively support UNHCR in preserving its ability to uphold core aspects of its mandate through focusing even more on protection, durable solutions, and emergency response. In the coming years, we need to increase our support not only to those forcibly displaced persons, but also to the host states and communities that shelter them. Put simply, we'll need to do more with less, and we'll need to reach beyond traditional humanitarian approaches when doing so. Such approaches, however, must be done in a way that upholds the core humanitarian principles of independence, impartiality, neutrality, and humanity. Equally, it must not compromise the ethics which underpin humanitarian action and solidarity. Finally, if we are to avoid a world defined by chaos, this Council must address not only humanitarian symptoms of current crisis, but the underlying political drivers. Take risks, as the High Commissioners advocated. This Council should remain focused on finding political solutions to conflicts while ensuring that principled humanitarian action remains safeguarded and enabled. Humanitarian obligations must not be made conditional or subject to political negotiations. Mr. President, to conclude, Denmark reaffirms its unwavering support for UNHCR and the Global Refugee Compact. This agency represents multilateralism at its best, a shared commitment to solidarity with people who've been cruelly uprooted and dispossessed. You can continue to rely on Denmark to play its part. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Denmark for that statement. I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Slovenia.
And I also want to thank High Commissioner Grandi for his presentation and an update on the work of the UNHCR. We also want to thank him for guiding us through several conflicts from a perspective of civilians, refugees and IDPs. And we appreciate your passionate appeal to the members of this Council. Mr. President, the record number of women, men and children have been forced from the places they once called home this year. New records fall as entire societies, such as the one in Gaza, are being torn from their roots with ferocious speed. Ukrainians continue to flee the bombing against the call of this Council for Peace. In Sudan alone, as many colleagues have recalled already, almost 13 millions, nearly a third of the nation, now wander in search of safety. These are not mere numbers. It is a display of a world in distress, a display of people pushed into poverty and hunger and exposed to disease, violence, exploitation, and abuse. For displaced women and girls, this includes increased risks of sexual and gender-based violence. There is one truth hiding behind all these shattered lives: the relentless disregard for international humanitarian law. We are witnessing its erosion with increasing speed. It is Security Council responsibility to protect the laws that guided humanity for past 75 years. Mr. President, my delegation would like to outline 3 points, 3 directions that this Council and international community should be making in order to stop and reverse these dangerous trends. First, save lives, protect people, enable aid. We demand the absolute protection of civilians, always and everywhere. That protection extends to every humanitarian worker, to every United Nations and associated staff, whether flown in from afar or recruited from the very communities they serve. Humanitarian access is not a matter of discretion. It is a legal obligation of every country under international law. Second, confront the climate displacement storm. Like Guyana, we want to point at the disaster that lingers in silence: climate change. Its effects present an everyday growing challenge, which calls for enhanced collaboration and action. Climate-fueled floods, fires, and prolonged droughts now drive families from their homes as ruthlessly as any gunmen or bombs. Environmental degradation and water scarcity amplify existing conflicts and seed new ones, striking civilians hardest both during and after war. We therefore insist that climate and environment considerations be woven systematically and without delay into every strand of conflict prevention, resolution, and peace building. Third, support the humanitarians and end statelessness. High Commissioner Filippo Grandi and the men and women of UNHCR serve on the very front lines of human need. They have our deepest respect, and they must feel and get our concrete support. As the Council, we must do more for protection of humanitarian workers and for ending impunity for attacks against them. Through its development aid, Slovenia is committed to continue addressing the root causes of migration. It has been responding to needs of conflict victims and displaced population, and it has been assisting safe returns of refugees. We have ratified the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, and we will soon join the Global Alliance to End Statelessness. Mr. President, these 3 directions, if we follow them, our chances to change the tone and substance of meetings with High Commissioner and many other meetings in the future will be better. Let's step up our efforts. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant permanent de...
I thank the permanent representative of Slovenia for that statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Greece. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I would like to start by thanking the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, for his in-depth yet sobering briefing, as well as his very important messages he conveyed to us. My country, Greece, would like to express its appreciation to the High Commissioner for continuous and ardent dedication to his mandate. We extend our full and unwavering support to his work, as it has been clearly manifested during his visit last year in our country and his meetings with political leadership, but also during a fruitful interaction in the framework of the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Mr. President, the world is currently facing one of the most significant humanitarian challenges of our time: the forced displacement of millions of people due to armed conflicts, violence, human rights violation, economic and social insecurity, food insecurity, natural disasters, and the impact of climate change. The number speaks for themselves and reflects a vicious circle of violence and deterioration of living conditions with dire impact on regional and international stability and peace. The numbers also reflect a blunt reality. the uprooting of human beings from their lives by forces beyond their control. Ongoing crises in Gaza, Syria, Ukraine, Sudan, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Haiti, and Venezuela are major drivers of forced displacement. Mr. President, allow me to highlight the following key points. All of the conflicts mentioned share two common features: the blatant disregard of international humanitarian law by parties to conflicts and the lack of accountability. Both features have a devastating effect on civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian personnel. We firmly believe that it is our duty as members of the Security Council to, first, ensure respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law, second, step up humanitarian action in order to support refugees and displaced persons and the countries hosting them, and third, find meaningful solutions to reverse the displacement trends. Greece will continue to work in the context of the Security Council and beyond towards these goals. As one of the frontline European Union member states receiving still large number of mixed arrivals, Greece contributes to the implementation of UNHCR's mandate by hosting a significant number, in relation to its populations, of refugees and asylum seekers. My country prioritizes protection of most vulnerable groups, especially women and children, who are exposed to gender-based violence, exploitation, separation from families, lack of access to education, long-term psychological trauma. We have developed a comprehensive support system for unaccompanied minors, comprising inter alia, accommodation, healthcare, nutrition, education, guardianship, and integration, based on the best interests of the child. Our relevant strategy builds on the enhancement of the protection of children, especially for violence exploitation, and the establishment of legal pathways for joining family members through multilateral agreements for relocation and family reunification. The management of refugee flows poses multiple challenges. At the epicenter of our common priorities on this issue lies the need for effective returns. Moreover, we remain gravely concerned about the involvement of criminal smuggling networks that exploit human suffering along migration routes, and of course about the heinous practices of instrumentalization of migration, which is in total disregard of international law. Mr. President, in closing, let me stress that against a discouraging backdrop of a world in crisis marked by armed conflicts, climate emergency, human rights violation, Greece reiterates its call for tangible actions in order to uphold international humanitarian law, address the root causes of the refugee and displacement crisis, opt for local and regional solutions, increase the scale of funding for humanitarian assistance, and commit to the protection of forcibly displaced persons. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Greece for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Mr. Filippo Grandi, United Nations Commissioner for Refugees, for his comprehensive briefing and valuable insights. Sierra Leone commends the UNHCR and the High Commissioner in particular for the efforts and commitment in assisting refugees and displaced persons. Mr. President, Sierra Leone is deeply alarmed by the escalating global crisis of displacement affecting refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons. The urgency of this situation cannot be overstated. Millions being forcibly uprooted by persecution, armed conflict, violence, human rights violations, climate-related disasters, and other catastrophic events. By June of last year, the global number of forcibly displaced persons had reached a staggering 122 million, including about 72 million internally displaced persons. This surge reflects the increasing number of conflicts worldwide. Africa, in particular, bears a disproportionate burden, hosting over 1/3 of the world's forcibly displaced persons, including nearly 22 million internally displaced persons. The crisis is particularly severe in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where intensified conflict and targeted attacks on densely populated areas have driven significant displacement. In view of the disturbing trends and growing challenges facing displaced populations, Sierra Leone wishes to highlight 3 key points. First, we urge the Security Council to ensure the protection of displaced civilians in accordance with international human rights and humanitarian law. Despite existing legal frameworks and the Council's call, notably through Security Council Resolution 1265, parties to conflict continue to violate their obligations. We're witnessing relentless and targeted violence in Sudan, DRC, Ukraine, Myanmar, and Haiti, often involving destructive weapons such as drones and ballistic missiles. In Gaza, indiscriminate bombardments, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and attacks on humanitarian personnel remain deeply troubling and are clear violations of international humanitarian law. Women and girls continue to bear the brunt of armed conflicts, displacement, and climate crisis. Beyond the loss of agency, livelihoods, education, and basic services, they face escalating levels of sexual and gender-based violence. Harrowing reports have emerged from Sudanese women fleeing to Chad, Congolese women in displacement camps around Goma and Rohingya, women and girls in long-term refugee camps in Bangladesh. Climate-induced disaster further compound their vulnerability and increase the severity of such violence. Such suffering, inhumanity, and the existence of constant fear cannot be overemphasized and are a clear display of a breach of international human rights law and humanitarian law. Second, the Security Council and the broader UN system must intensify efforts to ensure life-saving assistance reaches those in need in accordance with Security Council Resolution 1674. This is especially vital amid declining humanitarian funding and increased restrictions on aid delivery imposed by belligerents. Humanitarian support for displaced persons must be grounded in a firm commitment to humanitarian principles alongside efforts to advance sustainable peace and development. In this context, we strongly commend the growing number of attacks against humanitarian personnel, particularly in Gaza and Sudan, and call for accountability for those responsible. Peace processes must prioritize civilian protection and uphold the core humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. The safe, voluntary, and dignified return of refugees to their countries of origin remains critical for long-term peace and stability, including the Middle East, where from the High Commissioner's briefing today, we learned that over 1 million Syrian refugees are returning home after years of conflict. Third, as co-chair of the Security Council's informal group on women, peace, and security, and a member of the board of the Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action, Sierra Leone commends the UNHCR for its leadership in this compact. We also acknowledge its partnership with the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund and its collaborations with agencies like WFP and ILO through programs such as Skill UP and Africa and the Middle East. These initiatives provide displaced persons with access to training, protection, and asylum, deliver life-saving aid, and work to reduce statelessness. We further welcome regional efforts to address statelessness, including the African Union's adoption of the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in 2024. In closing, Mr. President, Sierra Leone reiterates the urgent call for countries and development partners to respond to the critical needs of displaced persons. UNHCR's global appeal of the $10.2 billion for displaced and stateless populations remains sadly underfunded, with only $1.5 billion received to date. We hope today's briefing serves as a catalyst for action, including through compassionate and responsive refugee and asylum policies. I thank you.
Floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I want to start by underlining our wholehearted support for UNHCR and High Commissioner Grandi's passionate leadership. You have steered the organisation through a decade of global change, a decade of increasing conflict, climate shocks, and instability. All these factors continue to push people from their homes, driving displacement ever higher. In the world today, over 123 million people are forcibly displaced. In the face of such challenges, we must focus on solutions. I will highlight three that are priority areas for the UK. First, we will continue to do all we can to tackle the root causes of displacement, including war, instability, and repression. We will work at all levels, including through this Council, to protect the rules-based international system and promote peace. We will work with international partners to tackle people smuggling and human trafficking, which exploits vulnerable people for financial gain. Just this month, the UK led a successful border security summit where we secured agreements between participating countries to drive efforts to disrupt organised immigration crime and save lives. Second, we will seek solutions to regional and country-specific crises, many of which, from Ukraine to the Middle East, are the focus of this Council. This month, the UK hosted a conference on Sudan with humanitarian and political objectives, including support for an end to the conflict and easing the impact on the region. And we were grateful for the participation of Commissioner Grandi, along with other parts of the UN leadership. In Cox's Bazar, we have funded UNHCR to support refugees access to healthcare, clean water and hygiene. We will continue to advocate for safe, dignified and sustainable solutions for refugees, including at the UN Rohingya conference in September. And third, we continue to push for innovative approaches to addressing displacement. We support the High Commissioner's Sustainable Responses Initiative, which supports refugee inclusion and self-reliance and ownership of solutions by host countries. We look forward to the Global Compact for Refugees meeting in December, a key moment to review progress on pledges we made in 2023 to deliver better outcomes for displaced people and host communities. And we encourage others to join and sustain our collective efforts to achieve the Compact's goals. In conclusion, President, to reverse the growing trend of displacement, we need to focus on solutions to the causes we have all discussed today. The UK is committed to working with UNHCR and other international partners and institutions to achieve this. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Somalia welcomes High Commissioner Grandi to this meeting and thank him for his comprehensive briefing. Since it's your last time, I join others in also thanking you for your dedicated leadership in fulfilling your mandate in a challenging environment. We recognize and commend UNHCR's tireless efforts in protecting and assisting more than 122 million people forcibly displaced worldwide, an unprecedented figure that has more than doubled in the past decade. In that regard, I wish to highlight three critical aspects of this global challenge. First, the scale and complexity of the current displacement crisis requires unprecedented coordination and response. We are witnessing displacement at a scale that tests the limits of our humanitarian systems. In Sudan alone, millions have been uprooted from their homes, while in Gaza, over 3/4 of the population face displacement multiple times over. UNHCR's presence in these crises, as well as in Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, and Democratic Republic of Congo, remains vital for delivering protection and coordinated humanitarian responses. Second, we know the deep concern documented of the erosion of international humanitarian law. Our humanitarian workers continue to document rising civilian casualties, weaponized hunger and sexual violence, and deliberate attacks on critical infrastructure. We must reinforce our commitment to international humanitarian law and human rights principles. This Council's Resolution 1265, 1674, and 2417 provide the framework for protecting civilians and ensuring humanitarian access. Yet, without a renewed commitment to these principles, we risk failing those who need our protection the most. Third, and perhaps most crucially, we must address the root causes of displacement. The intersection of conflict and inequalities creates continued storm of vulnerability. We must prioritize durable solutions while addressing the specific needs of vulnerable populations. Safe and voluntary and dignified return, local integration, and resettlement must be pursued in close consultation with affected communities and host countries. The particular needs of women, children, and other vulnerable groups demand our focused attention, especially in preventing and responding to sexual violence in displaced settings. We call for sustained international assistance to ensure returns are sustainable and basic services and livelihoods are restored. Mr. President, to conclude, Somalia recognizes the severe financial constraints facing UNHCR. We appeal to all member states and donors to scale up their generous support. Adequate, predictable, and flexible funding is essential for UNHCR to fulfill its mandate and respond effectively to growing displacement needs. Every refugee, regardless of background or skill set, deserves dignity and a durable solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I will now deliver a statement in my capacity as the representative of France. I wish first and foremost to thank Mr. Filippo Grandi for his briefing before the Security Council. As was customary, it was an excellent briefing. Mr. Grandi, you have provided us with an unvarnished overview of the plight of forcibly displaced persons seeking safety by setting out recommendations to alleviate the suffering endured by these individuals. High Commissioner, France applauds the remarkable work that you have achieved over the nearly 10 years of your mandate. France pays tribute to your commitment to refugee populations, stateless persons, and forcibly displaced persons. And through you, we pay tribute to the dedication of the men and women who are delivering upon the mission of the HCR throughout the world. I am thinking of those who were wounded, those who have lost their lives, delivering upon the increasingly difficult missions in Syria, in Lebanon, in Sudan, in Ukraine, in the DRC, in Afghanistan, and throughout the world where their efforts are indispensable. It is the responsibility of the Security Council to be seized of these threats and challenges to international peace and security. These are crises and conflicts which lie at the heart of the majority of forced displacements. We cannot merely allow HCR to deal with the consequences thereof. HCR is increasingly finding it difficult to do so, clearly as the crises plaguing the world proliferate, as there are increasingly serious obstructions to international rights and protection of civilians. France reaffirms at the Security Council the steadfast political commitment to efforts of the HCR. HCR was created in the wake of the Second World War on a temporary basis to deliver assistance to millions of Europeans who fled their homes in the hopes that a lasting solution to the question of refugees, displaced persons, and stateless persons will be arrived at. This mandate was repeatedly renewed, and it was extended indefinitely by the General Assembly in 2003. Forced displacements continue to increase. They remain one of the main consequences of crises and conflict, where civilians are the main casualties. In 2025, 140 million people were forced into exile, 60 million in 2015. The number in 2015 was 60 million. This is a significant increase. The development reflects a world plagued by conflict, where this conflict spreads, and this is compounded by food insecurity, health, sanitary crises, human rights violations, climate change, and economic shocks. The Security Council, as well as the international community, bear responsibility to deliver support to displaced persons and those who provide accommodation for them. This is a matter of solidarity, a matter of humanity, and a question of the maintenance of international peace and security. As you have mentioned, High Commissioner, risks of a drastic reduction in financing are clear. They include human tragedies, instability, and an increase in forced displacement. People who have already been displaced will have no other choice but to once again enter into exile. We need to be cognizant of these challenges by rethinking our collective action to ensure that it be more effective, efficient, and have a greater impact by bringing together local stakeholders, host countries, and transit countries. France in 2023 co-chaired the World Refugee Forum alongside Germany, Japan, Colombia, and Uganda. We adopted robust commitments to increase our support for HCR, to provide assistance to the initial country of reception of refugees, and to ensure responsible sharing through capacity building in the area of asylum and legal means of access to areas of accommodation. France has advanced a multi-stakeholder initiative called Avec Elle to provide protection for integration of women and girls who are refugees throughout their refugee and exile journey, and this includes the support of a number of partners. Our collective initiatives are reflected in stepped-up support for the Global Compact on Refugees. This compact has established a framework for our concerted action. This is an investment in stability to facilitate access for refugees, to realize their potential in dignity, and to provide support for host countries. Countries hosting refugees, often at a high cost, is of vital importance. Mr. High Commissioner, on behalf of France, I wish once again to thank you before the members of the Security Council for your unstinting commitment to refugees and displaced persons and all of those who provide them with accommodation. I resume my functions as the President of the Security Council. I will give the floor to Mr. Filippo Grandi to respond to observations and to deliver further remarks. Thank you, Mr. President, for your kind words of appreciation and support, which have been duly noted.
Just add a few remarks to the points made by all of you. First of all, to say that I appreciate not only the expressions of support that all of you have shared with us today, but also, and in particular, the affirmation made by many of you of the importance of respecting international law and refugee law, including in matters related to receiving refugees and dealing with those that request asylum. You will not be surprised, this being at the core of my mandate and of the mandate of my organization, if I say that, of course, not only I appreciate your statements, but I trust that they will translate in actual policies that do respect refugee law and the right of people fleeing conflict or persecution to seek asylum in your and other countries. I do appreciate as well that states, in making those choices, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, have to balance many considerations, including security, social impact, and possible destabilization. I trust as well that those considerations will be balanced with those regarding international protection of refugees. The response to increasingly complex movements of people must, of course, be informed by the need to control and to ensure security for your own citizens, naturally, but also can only be effective if besides these controls, measures offering opportunities to people on the move are enacted. That's the only way to manage along the routes, as we have said many times, these very complicated population flows. And thank you, Mr. President, and others for having referred to the Global Compact on Refugees. The Global Compact on Refugees, which the General Assembly affirmed in 2018, as you know, is really, as I always say, a toolbox offered to states to better deal with population movements that are increasingly complex and needs to be looked at and needs to be dealt with, this toolbox, in conjunction with the other toolbox that the United Nations affirmed on the same day, the Global Compact on Migration, because the two are really complementary. The second point I wanted to make is that, of course, many of you mentioned crisis and situations, including refugee situations, that I only briefly alluded to or not mentioned in my initial remarks, as always having to contain the remarks within a limited period of time. One cannot, unfortunately, mention the many crises around the world. I'm thinking of the crisis that has been devastating actually for decades, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We are witnessing as we speak actually an outflow of Congolese refugees into neighboring countries. Another region that is witnessing conflict and displacement is, of course, the Central Sahel in West Africa, that from where people are being displaced not only within the same countries, but also to neighboring countries, including coastal states in West Africa. Some of you have mentioned the continuous difficult situation in Venezuela that has produced a major migration and refugee displacement in Latin America and increasingly beyond, in fact. Afghanistan was mentioned. Afghanistan continues to be a complex situation in respect of human rights, but also in respect of hardship and physical hardship for millions of people, with millions of Afghans displaced in the region, in particular in Pakistan and Iran. I could continue. I just wanted to flag that, of course, we are engaged in all this and other places. The one place where, as I said at the beginning, but almost all of you have mentioned it, we're not engaged because of the division labor with UNRWA, of course, is the occupied Palestinian territory and Gaza in particular. I take note of the many mentions that you have made of that devastating crisis, just to flag that although UNHCR is not involved as the head of a large humanitarian organization, I fully share the concerns and the appeals made by the Secretary General and some of my fellow heads of agency regarding the urgency of returning to the ceasefire, the urgency of releasing the hostages, and may I say, the urgency of bringing a very weakened and fragile peace process back on track, because it's only through that we can avoid, even after a ceasefire, the recurrence of conflict and of impact on civilian. Some of you have made mentions, directly or indirectly, to the increasing complexity also of conflict. The representative of Guyana, for example, mentioned the increasing role of criminality, of gangs, which are one of the main factors of displacement in Latin America, but also in the Sahel and in other places. This is it is very important to take that into account in order to better inform your responses and our responses to this crisis. And the same applies to the impact of climate crisis, of extreme weather events, droughts, floods, diminishing of resources that are at the root of many conflicts also. Think of the Horn of Africa, think of West Africa again, and other parts of the world. An area in which, of course, humanitarian agencies have to renew the manner in which they respond to crisis, but which require also on the political and security side the cooperation of this Council. Thanks to those of you, practically all, that have mentioned the importance of continuing to support financially humanitarian organizations and UNHCR in particular. I cannot emphasize more how dramatic the situation is in this very period of time. I am leading an internal effort which may conclude with the retrenchment of my organization to up to 1/3 of its capacity. 1/3. We're one of the largest humanitarian organizations in the UN system, and some of my fellow heads of agency are leading similar efforts, World Food Program, IOM, some of whom we work, of course, very closely with. I have spoken about this the other day at ECOSOC. I was invited to speak at an event on displacement that was very useful, and that is perhaps the forum to talk about these issues. But you must also understand that the retrenchment, the retreat of agencies like UNHCR, like the World Food Program, like UNICEF, from the theaters of crisis will have also impact on matters of peace and security, because we will be much less able to exercise what is, after all, a stabilizing function in those areas, not only in respect of onward population movement, as I have mentioned in my opening remarks, but also of the stability of those regions. If the current trend continues in terms of freeze, in terms of cuts that unfortunately many countries have announced, many donor countries are announced, the humanitarian system will be gravely retrenched. The ambassador of Denmark spoke very eloquently about that. I just have to not take exception, but note further that if this trend continues, we will not be able to do more with less. But as I have said many times, we will do less with less. We are already doing less with less. We are already cutting, I speak for UNHCR, programs in education and health to focus on certain sectors. We are already cutting, I say this because it was mentioned by Sierra Leone and others, we are already cutting valuable protection program like programs aimed at countering gender-based violence that all of you care very deeply about, but many of these programs were funded by financing initiatives that are not there anymore. And we will, of course, do our best to do less with less in the best possible manner, in the most strategic and effective manner. We will take every opportunity within UNHCR, but also in the context of the humanitarian reset led by Tom Fletcher, by the ERC, also in the context of the UN 80 initiative of the Secretary General. We will do our best to remain strong and present and effective, but it will be very tough if these trends do not reverse. I hear so much, as you do, of the need to rebalance defense spending, to deal with possible trade tensions around the world. I hear very little in political circles about the terrible impact that the decline in bilateral and multilateral aid, humanitarian and development aid, will have on individuals that are affected, on countries that are affected, and on international relations. So I'm sorry to elaborate a bit more. In assuring you that we will do whatever is in our power to respond to this in the best possible way. Sustainable responses is one of the initiatives that we have put in place to respond to this, but there will be less offices, there will be less programs, there will be less operations. So I really am grateful to countries like Denmark and Korea that have announced that they will remain stable in their funding and flexible in their funding, and I hope that others will follow their example. Please allow me to take this opportunity really to stress on this particular point. And to conclude, Mr. President, and as I might be taking leave from you in this capacity that I have at the moment, although I still have 8 months to go, so if you need me, I'm here. Just to say that this debate and listening carefully to all of you proves again the point that I have learned many, many years ago when I was not the High Commissioner, but I was sitting in the back of other High Commissioners listening to their statements, that there is an inextricable link between the work that you do here, that you should do here, as the Security Council, and the work that an organization like mine, which is purely humanitarian, but which deals with issues that are the result of political crisis and of conflict. There is a very important and inextricable link. So we will continue to urge you to do as best as you can, because we do realize also the challenges that we are facing, to be as united as possible, to try to bring to an end these conflicts that cause the displacement crisis. And remembering, as many of you have reminded us, that solutions are important also in these wars, because more than 70% of the refugees are in poor or in developing countries. The vast majority of the refugees are, or of the 123 million, are either displaced in their own country or in the country next to where the crisis is. So a solution of the crisis can reduce this figure quite quickly if those efforts are successful. So please, let me repeat what I said. Continue to remain engaged, try to be as united as possible, take some calculated risks. You know, I've seen in my long career, more than 40 years dealing with this crisis, a decreasing appetite to take the risks that are necessary, especially to restore and to build peace. I mentioned Syria. I mentioned even Myanmar, an even more complex situation, and I could mention other contexts in which, you know, we could embark on a solution, but the international community is a bit reluctant to take risks, and the risks are political, essentially. That's why I'm addressing this point to you, because they're very much part of our work. And I say this also with a sense of gratitude for all the support that I have always received from you individually. In this same body, UNHCR will unfortunately observe this year its 75th anniversary. It was mentioned, it was founded in 1950. It is not a date to celebrate, but one perhaps on which to reflect on the challenges that we all face and to try and find some inspiration to address them together. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Mr. Filippo Grandi for his additional comments provided to this Council, and I welcome his work at the head of the UNHCR. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.